Thank you very much, AJ. Let me just figure out how I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? Can you see the
Yes,
screen?
I can see it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, AJ, and thank you to you and Rory and to all your team at Transportavion for organizing this. I think it's very important that we discuss these issues and that we share and hear what each other have to say, especially at an uncertain time like this. The next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'll be talking about coming from it from a slightly different angle to what Dinesh has done, and I think it transitions very well because I'll be focusing a bit more on the long-term impact of the pandemic and more on what potential change in society and how we see and do things in the future, and what impact this would have on the shipping industry as a whole. So just before I begin, just a little bit about myself. And so I worked for many years at Drury. So actually, I used to be a colleague with Dinesh. And now I work for Royal Haskoning it's been a bit more than 3 years now, specifically for Ocean Shipping Consultant, which is a sister company of Royal Haskoning. So about the company, we are one of the leading engineering firm in the world. It was founded some 130 years ago now. The turnover was 600 million in 2018. We're ranked second in marine and port by ENR, and we have about 6,000 employees scattered around 100 offices in 35 countries, of which many are dedicated to ports specifically. The company covers a number of services from aviation to building and industry, mining, urban development, water, and we have a maritime sector within which the team that I sit with, Ocean Shipping Consultants, is part of. So Ocean Shipping Consultants, what we do is we do projects literally in every country around the world. We have our offices in London, where I sit, the Netherlands, and Singapore. We've been working for more than 200 clients. This include port authority, terminal operators, investors, infrastructure funds, shipping lines, logistic operators. And what we typically do is we do a lot of market studies, due diligence, feasibility studies, and strategy studies. I would say this is the core of the business that we do. We also have a team of investment services that look at, they do financial modelings and aid in decision makings, especially with the public sector. Now, just before I begin, I want to reiterate some of the things that have been said before. And our role, I mean, my role in the job that I have as a forecaster, making projections, and the role of many of my colleagues and other people in the same industry is to try to make sense of the data that we have. As you all know, forecasts are never entirely accurate, and what we do is try to make a compromise based on the data that we have available to try to make sense and to give an accurate view of what we would expect the outlook to look like. Now with the global pandemic and the coronavirus, this has all been made much more difficult. There are a lot of things that we don't know about the virus. We don't know if it mutates, so it might evolve in the future and we might not be out of it for a while. We might get it twice. There's still a question mark about this. People talk about herd immunity, but it's not really proven that we can't get it more than once. And if we have immunity, how long it will last. We talk a lot about vaccines. What I hear is that it will be at least a year, year and a half before it actually comes. And my personal view is the only way to fully resolve this is once we get the vaccine. Even the statistics that we saw, and so Dinesh showed some of them from WHO, and there's the Johns Hopkins University that publishes it every day. These statistics are not entirely accurate because every country measures it differently. And here, for example, in the UK, what we measure is we only measure the number of deaths and the cases in hospital. So what is not measured in England and Northern Ireland is people who die in care home, people who die in their own house. So the number are quite significantly underestimated. And I know many other countries have different ways of reporting. So it's not really so simple to just compare one country to the other. And that has an impact when we talk about peak, reaching the peak, when we will get past the peak, and when we will recover. So I think that's important to note. So what I will do now is broadly, I'm going to first talk about the situation, how we got to where we are now in terms of trade, and what is being talked about in terms of the outlook. And I will finish with what my views are on, as I say, on more on the longer term outlook for shipping and for society as a whole. So this chart that I'm now showing you shows the growth in container trade, global container trade, and the growth in GDP. As I think we all know, there's quite a strong correlation and link between GDP and container trade. And what we can see here is while things fluctuates, generally, there's been a lot of there's sort of a downward trend that you can see if we look at the last 30 or so years. The fluctuation are driven by major events and things like in the early 90s, there was a collapse of the Soviet Unions. You had the Asian crisis towards the end of the 90s, the dot-com bubble, 9/11 here. And then, of course, here you had the global financial crisis. And what I want to focus on, and what I will then talk a bit more also later, is the relationship between the growth of GDP and the growth of container. And what this, what we call multiplier, what this is basically the link between the two. So if we look at before 2000, we had a multiplier of about 3.25. And what that means is on average, if you had a GDP growth of 1%, you could expect that global container trade would grow by 3.25%, so 3.25 times higher. After 2000 and until the global crisis, that was pretty much at the same level, if we look at the average. And then there's been a steep decrease after the crisis. So I broke this in chunk from 2000 to 2014. On average, there was a multiplier of 2.2. And then in the last 5 years or so, we're seeing 1.15. And I think this is important to see, and I will come back to this a bit later. But what I want to talk a bit now is what is then driving this decrease, because essentially that means that, as you can see, growth in GDP has generally been quite stable, a few up and downs, but then there are wide variation in the blue line there, and quite a notably decrease there. So this is driven by a number of factors that I will talk about a bit later. But if we look at the outlook now, there are various providers of GDP projections, and I'm showing you here the Oxford Economics. There's the IMF also have their own projections, the Economist Intelligence Units, and there are others. But essentially, this is to illustrate the point. I've took here two different projections, one that was from February 2020 and one that was released last week, so in April. And what you can see is that in February, before the pandemic became a real global issue, before it started spreading widely in the United States and throughout Europe, what the Oxford Economic was projecting was that there would be a slight decrease in GDP in 2020, immediate recovery, and then broadly over the long term, you would have a year-on-year increase of about 3% or just below 3%. What they're now projecting is a much steeper decrease of -3% next year, and then immediate recovery to 6% in 2021, and then slowly stabilizing to their sort of 3 or just under 3 long-term line. My view is that I think this might be a little bit optimistic to see such a strong recovery in 2021. But as I say, there are various providers there, and everyone will have their own view on this. But what this means is that if we think about this 1.15 multiplier, what I've done is just to do a broad sort of back of envelope calculation by estimating what the global container trade would be based on this new GDP forecast and based on the one from February. And that's what you see here. So the line in gray is what we had in February, and the one in blue is what is now being forecast as implied global container trade. So based on the new forecast, by the end of the year, we will have a global container trade, we'll have a drop of -5.6%. But then because there's an immediate recovery projected, if we just look a couple of years down the line, by 2025, we are pretty much at the same level as what was being projected back in February. So that's one view, and as things start to come in, generally this -5.6% is quite aligned with what I'm seeing when we look at the first quarter results of some of the companies, especially the big companies in Asia, because Asia is now probably going to be the first region that comes out slowly of the lockdown and start opening up. This is more or less aligned with what we are seeing in these early days. Now, if I come back to this famous multiplier that I was talking about, I want to go through a bit some of the drivers of what has been driving this decrease in the multiplier. And there are a number of factors. We've now seen there was a lot of offshoring in the last 20 years where companies were moved to China and to other parts of Southeast Asia. That was a one-time effect. So it has happened. That had a big impact in the last 15 years or so on global container trade. But that is now over. And what we are now seeing is more and more reshoring. We see that a lot in the US, especially since Donald Trump has become in power. We see that in some countries in Europe as well, with a big emphasis on domestic trade and trying to produce locally for your own consumption. The Chinese economy has also slowly been shifting towards more domestic consumption and trying to source more regionally. So that's also having an impact on the level of container trade globally. There's also a plateauing in the level of containerization. So over the years, we had a lot of commodities that used to be carried in break bulk that have been containerized. And that's still happening to a certain extent in developing countries, in Africa and South America. But generally, that has already reached a plateau and a ceiling in most countries. So that's the first point. There's also an increase towards miniaturization of manufactured goods. And when we look at the mobile phone that we're using nowadays, this used to be 3 or 4 times the size a year ago. Computers. Now we don't really read. Very few people actually read physical books. People read it online. We had CDs before. Now everything is transferred via the internet. So a lot of these things are also impacting on the amount of commodities that are traded in containers nowadays compared to before. There's also an improvement of port facilities to accommodate larger ships. So we had a cascading effect from the increase in ship size, which meant a lot of large ships that were being replaced were being put on secondary trade, such as the North route, the North-South route, or some of more regional routes, and that meant that port had to adapt and increase their facilities to be able to handle these larger ships. So as a result, now we have more ports that are part of direct mainline services, and we'll also have a gradual reduction in the need for transshipment, which is impacting on the overall level of container trade. So that's a bit to give a bit of background to what led to this decrease in the multiplier. And what I will now give you is some of my views on how I see the impact of the coronavirus, especially on the longer term, and what it could have on the shipping industry as a whole. So the first point is that well, I mean, there's two sides to this. We've seen a lot of very nice stories of people clapping for the health service on the balconies, and people are coming together. It started in Italy, and then it spread out to other countries. Now many countries are doing that. But I think generally what I'm seeing is that countries are being more individualistic about the situation, and they're looking after their own interest. And probably the most concrete example of that is the current shortage of equipment, of personal protection equipment and testing kits. And countries are really competing against each other to try to secure the testing kits and the material that they need. So I think that there's a bit of a change in the mindset, and it will be interesting to see how much of this stays when this is all over, and how will people and government react to what is happening now. We're also seeing some cracks, and here where I am in Europe, there's been a lot of talk about the rescue package from the European Union to countries like Italy and Spain that have been most affected. That has created a lot of tensions, and we've seen some cracks in the solidity and solidarity of the European Union, with countries looking after generally after their own interests. So that's also something to keep an eye to, and it will most definitely have an impact on shipping and trade. I talked about increased reshoring before, and like I said, there's many countries have been competing a bit more, but that also apply to some of their trade. And for example, with Kazakhstan at the end of March, that suspended its export of several types of vegetable to try to secure their domestic market. Russia also suspended its exports of processed grain for 10 days at the beginning of April. And we had large importing countries, grain importing countries like Turkey and Algeria, which have released new tenders to try to get more of these commodities that are now becoming more of a scarce commodity on the global market. So I think this also illustrates the point of what will happen will then drive the demand and the trade in the future. People talk about globalization, threat to globalization. Many people have different views about it. My view are, and that's more from personal experience, that I used to go to the supermarket. I used to find things out of season. I used to buy my strawberries in the middle of January, and they were coming from the Southern Hemisphere. And what has happened, especially early on during this crisis, is a lot of fruit and vegetable coming from other countries in Europe were not coming anymore because one is truck drivers were not so keen on traveling long distance, going to other countries and putting themselves at risk. And there were also additional border control, which then delayed the whole supply chain. So what we've seen, and I think that applies in most countries, we've seen a loss of variety in supermarkets and people having to adapt to having less choice and reverting back to maybe what people used to do, how they used to do their shopping some 20 years ago. So it will be very interesting to see how this change, if some of that will remain, and that will definitely also impact on some of the trade of reefer goods, especially regional trade and containerized good. Now, cruise is something that hasn't been mentioned, but we've all seen the big image of Diamond Princess, of a Zandam ship stranded, and unfortunate people who were infected and who couldn't leave the ships, many of them who unfortunately have now passed away. That has really had a big impact, I think, in people's mind. And I think cruise will be heavily impacted and is in real danger of suffering long-term significant damage. The thing with cruise is that this is typically favored more by older people, and older people are obviously more prone to the disease that we are facing now, and generally to viruses in general. So being in a confined space for many weeks or sometimes months, sharing everything with other people like that on a very long period is obviously something that people will have to think long and hard whether they want to continue doing that in the future, especially until a vaccine can be found. So I think this will be a big change in my view in the future. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the a lot of the cruise companies will suffer significantly. The other point is about innovation. I believe we'll see an acceleration of development of new technology. For example, there's the autonomous shipping, which has been talked for some times now. And when you think about autonomous shipping, you're talking about less reliance on crew and less reliance on people who are obviously more prone to viruses, to disease, and it's also safer to have more automation on ships. It's also more efficient and productive. The same goes when you talk about port automation. Some ports are already automated, like Los Angeles, for example, or Rotterdam are highly automated. The question has always been twofold. One is there's a very big initial investment required to automate a terminal, and whether this investment is going to be viable in the long term. So whether the benefit, the obvious benefit that you get in terms of enhanced productivity will allow you to recover your investment. The other side is also in some countries more than others, there's the impact on the loss of job, and government are not so keen on seeing people losing their job. But that then creates other type of job. It moves from low-skilled job to more high-skilled job in terms of engineers and maintainers of these technologies and robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on. So I think generally we'll see a trend towards an increase of development of this new technology. Another example is drone. So Amazon has been one of the pioneer in making deliveries of drone for small parcels. We see that already in some warehouse where they're using more and more drone to optimize their supply chain. What I also see in some ports as well is people starting to use drone to check equipment, to make health and safety checks. And I think this is also something that will probably continue and increase as a trend. Finally, maybe another point also is the 3D printing, which is very much in its early days. But 3D printing is something that I think will develop and allow people to be less reliant on transport of goods in certain cases. And I've got a personal stories to share about that, which I think is quite interesting. In the last couple of weeks, or 2 weeks ago, I was talking to some people that I had, and about we're checking each other on how we were doing working from home and so on. And I found out one of my contacts, he happened to have a 3D printer, in his house because he's a bit of a technology geek. And we started talking, and I think the issues we face here in the UK with the health system is the same as every country's, with lack of personal protective equipment. And we came up with the idea of trying to make the shield mask, which is the little plastic mask that doctors put in front of their face to protect themselves. So there's a big lack on the global market, and we ran through our contacts and we found a template and some of the material to make it, and we did a few of them. We only did a couple of dozen, which we then gave to our local hospital, but they were very, very grateful because they were not able to source any of that. And I think it's a bit of an example of how, in a situation like today, some of the technology can really make quite a big difference. Now, I think the final point that I want to make is one of the most important one, is on climate change. I believe there will be more of a focus on climate change and on the impact it's having and the ways to mitigate. There is some talk about how the increase in temperature has impacted on the ecosystems and is then forcing some animals to adapt to new environment, and that is then facilitating the environment for viruses to develop and also to become more resilient. So there's still studies that are being done on that, but I think this will be an important point in the future. There's also, I think we've all seen very nice stories with less traffic and less pollutions. The dolphins have come back in Venice. There were eagles flying over Milan, but normally only in the Alps. There was these very nice stories in Punjab, in Jalandhar, where people could see the Himalayas after 30 years because of the lowest level of pollution. So these are very strong and impactful images that I believe will remain in people's mind. And when this is over, people will then think long and hard, okay, so what society do I want to be living in? And something will become more important that maybe were not as important as before. So obviously I'm now working from home like most people. That's also a change of mindset. Many people are getting used to that and using their car less. So when we come back, will people start using the cars in the same way as they used to do before, or will there be a reduced use of cars in general? In the same way, I think what a lot of government will then do, they will prioritize development of some technologies such as high-speed broadband to allow people to work more from home. And as a result, you will have reduced demand for things like cars, but also for air travels. People, a lot of airline will unfortunately probably go bankrupt, and there will be a consolidation in the airline industries. But how much people will fly in the future, I think, remains to be seen. And all that, of course, has an impact on the demand for oil and on the tanker industry, and also for companies looking at renewable and alternative energy, like cleaner energy, like LNG, for example. So these are some thoughts, I think, that are very interesting, and I don't have the direct answer at the moment, but I think they will play a big role in the future, in the long-term future. So I want to end there, and I will just end with a bit of a more positive, maybe a lighter note. We're all seeing a lot of jokes that we're sharing, I guess, to each other nowadays a lot more. And I want to leave you with a joke that I received this morning that I thought was very good, and it is related to the maritime industry. So it's about Donald Trump, one of our favorite characters in the world. So I will let you read that because I thought it was quite funny. Thank you very much.